Hello and welcome to today's webinar from Real Story Group. Excited to have everyone here for today's discussion on how to select the right CDP technology. Certainly an exciting topic for us as it's something that we've been advising our customers on now for the last several years, but always top of mind for the folks that we're interacting with on a daily basis. So welcome and thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us. With me is our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, and our VP of Research and Advisory, Apoorv Durga. They'll take you through the heart of today's presentation, but just to get started, I want to mention a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, you will have time to ask questions, so throughout the session today, you're welcome to put questions into the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be able to get to those at the end of the session. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that everyone who's attending today will get a copy of the slides, and our subscribers will also be able to actually access this in your subscriber library after today's session. So keep an eye out for that from our subscribers. But to get started, I do see a lot of new names on the list here, so we'll just give you a quick little background about Real Story Group. We've been at this for 23 years. We're an analyst firm, but a little bit different than the other household names that sometimes you may be more familiar with. So the approach that we've always taken to our research is that, frankly, we don't work for any of the vendors that we cover. So we don't advise them on the strategy or write white papers for them. We are only focused on being on the buyer side of the table and helping you to make the right technology choices for your unique needs. And so what you'll hear today in the presentation is certainly that sort of no BS approach to describing what the vendors do well, but probably more importantly, what they don't do so well and the way they might fall short for you. So that's the lens that we're looking at for today's presentation. So with that, I'll turn things over to Tony and Apoorv. Guys?
Great, thanks, Scott. I'll start out and then Apoorv will be jumping in. We started at Real Story Group analyzing web content management and evaluating web content management, web CMS vendors. That's the blue line on this subway map. Over time, we've kind of grew to evaluating all kinds of different technologies across the MarTech and digital experience stack. And so, you know, a lot of these pieces interoperate, obviously. There's more than one piece to your stack. We'll talk about that. There's obviously a lot of vendors here who sell more than one thing. For a lot of these MarTech landscapes, a lot of these marketplaces, you have vendors in the city center that sell multiple different tools, and then in the orange line here, which is customer data platform, is like a lot of other MarTech lines where you have independent players out there as well. It's a significant market with a lot of different players. So, you know, you have a lot of choices. It's what analysts call a highly fragmented marketplace. And choice in general is good for you, but it can also be a little bit overwhelming. And so our job here today is to try to at least simplify how you approach this otherwise somewhat overwhelming task and help you be more successful. So what we're going to do over the next half hour or so is talk a little bit about the evolution of CDPs, some current trends in market landscape, which is really important for you, particularly from an architectural perspective, some of the choices you need to make. Then my colleague Apoorv is going to do a brief kind of future outlook about what's happening, particularly with respect to composability. So you want to keep that in mind. But then we'll spend the meat of our time talking about applying a more agile methodology to selecting CDPs before we wrap up with some key takeaways. So let's look a little bit about the past and future of CDPs. You know, they go back now more than 12 years when the first one started emerging from other sort of marketing platforms to try to decouple the data from the actual marketing engagement. Really kind of got a boost in 2018 as with more attention to GDPR and CCPA, and then we saw a real takeoff during the pandemic when many customers wanted to sort of know, you know, who are these customers and how can I activate them? So now we're in an era of 24 to 25 modern CDPs with some composability, AI-driven insights, and now the capability to do real time. The key thing about this is that not every CDP is here. When we look at some of major CDPs, we might sort of have them, although they're being marketed in 2024, from a generational standpoint, they're more of a second or third generation. In other words, if you look at Salesforce CDP, it's kind of, it's really more of a circa 2017, 2018 sort of CDP and not a 2024 CDP. So this is, I don't want to suggest that they're all here. In fact, some are more mature than others. And then we have going forward, really the next phase of this is really to serve as the basis for some key decisioning that you're going to want to make going forward. But Purv will have more to say about that. But the key thing that's really transpired, particularly accelerated by the pandemic at the beginning of this decade, is this architectural shift from headless to legless. So in the 2010s, there's a lot of conversations about headless WCM, headless e-commerce, where you decouple the engagement layer from your presentation layer, right? And so that you can have different presentations on top of the same engagement, content, and data. What we're seeing now in the 2020s is the advent of what we call legless architecture, where we're disconnecting core enterprise services around content and data from their engagement environments. And no platform has been more representative, more emblematic of this than CDPs, where we're finally liberating our customer data from these engagement environments and managing it as a unique layer in our stack, so that we can then apply those segments, apply those rules, apply that customer data across multiple different engagement silos. And so what this leads us to is what we've described as the MarTech architecture for the 2020s. This is the B2C version. We have a separate B2B version that's not really that much different, where you have engagement and interaction environments at the top. But the more interesting thing here is what's going on with the different colored boxes that you see in the middle. One are these engagement services. You could think of these as kind of channel silos, where historically we have kind of trapped a lot of our data and decisions and content. But what's increasingly happening, and what we're increasingly encouraging, is this kind of great legless decoupling, where with respect to content and information, data and decisioning, this is flowing now and quite properly should flow to the enterprise foundation layer. And CDPs are really part and parcel of that, leading the way on the data side. The other thing, of course, it's really important to recognize here is that AI really wants to work at this foundation level as well. Although many of these engagement services embed AI in their capabilities, you really want to be thinking about AI from a more foundational standpoint, much more effective, much more controllable, much more costly, much more cost effective, so on and so forth. And so AI, of course, is an increasing part of this whole story. But CDP is playing really in this middle layer here, customer data, maybe not doing all these things, and so we'll get into scope around that, but CDPs being really a kind of a almost essential part of your enterprise foundation going forward for omni-channel customer engagement. So let's look at some current trends. So in the last 3 years or so, we describe what we call as an industry maturation. There's the great MarTech decoupling that we're seeing with this advent of legless. Use case expansion for CDPs, for better or worse. There are at least 10K use cases that CDPs target. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into selection mode. There are issues arising about the scope of CDP. Are your CDP more focused on data processing versus activation? Vendors differ here. It's a key architectural distinction we'll get into. And then the other thing that's happened in the last 3 years is that the big suite vendors have joined what is a crowded and maturing marketplace. So this would be Adobe, Oracle, Microsoft, Salesforce, Acquia, and others, either building their own or acquiring platforms to kind of belatedly jump into the CDP space. So architecture is a really big deal here, particularly for those of you from larger enterprises. And it's so important to understand what exactly you're asking your CDP to do. Because in a more simpler model, of course, you have all this customer data on the left, first and zero party, maybe second and third party data. It goes into this middle area, and then obviously you want it to inform omni-channel engagement, targeted advertising, and perhaps enterprise analytics. But what we understand now about this middle piece here, the two boxes in the middle, is that these are logically very different things. Is that on the one hand, you need a process hub where you're doing customer data processing for ingesting, transforming, cleaning, unifying, doing identity resolution, the sort of things that your enterprise data ops team should do, versus customer data leverage, which should really be done in an activation hub. This is really where your marketing ops people step in and do the things that they need to do to actually leverage this customer data. Now, from a CDP standpoint, this could all be the same vendor. It could be two different vendors. One, the process hub could be more at your enterprise lakehouse. There's a lot of different architectural models, but it's really kind of important to understand that distinction. It's a key trend that we're seeing is logically distinguishing these two, even though you may not always physically distinguish these two. So that's where we are right now. We're going to have a Purv kind of delve into a brief kind of future outlook here, and then we'll spend the rest of our time talking about what's the right way to select a CDP.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah. We don't usually engage in crystal gazing, right? But let's make an exception here to explore where CDPs are heading in the near future or and beyond, right? So the emerging theme seems to be CDPs as decisioning engines, right? And that carries three significant aspects. The first one is composable decoupling, essentially decoupling from the lakehouse. Now, there's a lot of chatter about so-called composable CDPs that actually tie you to a DWH, data warehouse, right? I think that's actually anti-composability because they're saying do everything on top of your data warehouse, right? So a data warehouse holds all kinds of data, including marketing data, and so that's good because you have more data to run your campaigns and make decisions. But at the same time, you are unlikely to get a marketing friendly segmentation and activation environment if you were to use data warehouse for activation via, say, reverse ETL tools, right? So activation is really marketing ops and data warehouse is really data ops, and as you know, they are really different. So by all means, use a data warehouse. We have to live with it, but just don't tie yourself to a specific data warehouse or base everything on a single data warehouse. So in that sense, some decoupling is in order. The second one is about CDPs as decision hubs, right? So we have seen that standalone decisioning engines and journey orchestration tools haven't really taken off in a big way. And one reason for that is that for them to work really well, they need to be closer to data. And so that's where CDPs are getting in, right? So they have built, in some cases, lightweight decisioning capabilities. And additionally, machine learning is becoming a core feature of CDPs, enabling real-time reactions and decision making, etc. Right? So, for example, tailoring an offer based on browsing behavior within seconds. And the third aspect here is the extending the decisioning engine to orchestration layers, right? So CDPs as orchestration layer in figuring out who sees what, where, when, and why, right? So that's moving beyond decisioning, right? And CDPs are likely to act as orchestration layers that enable much more granular control over customer interactions across channels, right? So in this context, think of CDPs as a conductor of an orchestra, right? It may not play all the instruments, meaning it may not be an engagement channel or work as an engagement channel, but it ensures that they work together harmoniously, delivering the right message to the right audience at the right time in the right context, and so on and so forth, right? So in a sense, the future of CDPs revolves around enhancing their role in decision-making, orchestration, and integration, right? And that brings us to this slide about how composability is evolving in context of CDPs. Tony covered some of it already, right? So essentially, we see that CDP ecosystem is likely to focus on two distinct layers: customer data processing or the process hub, and customer data activation or the activation hub, right? So traditionally, CDPs aim to handle both these layers comprehensively, or at least vendors claimed they could, right? But modern CDPs are increasingly specializing in subset of these services, and this specialization is expected to grow in future, right? With one layer doing data processing, so ingest, transform, clean, process, etc., and the next layer doing more of activation, so putting the process data to actual use, right? So as organizations become more sophisticated, as they learn more, they are realizing that one size fits all doesn't work with CDPs, and so they are figuring out exactly what they want their CDP to accomplish, and then assembling solutions by composing different services, not necessarily from a single vendor.
That's right. And so I think in some respects, Apoor, wouldn't you say that all CDPs are composable to some extent? It's just a question of what you light up and what you don't. Yeah.
Yeah. And it also depends on your own definition of composability, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot more to say there. It's a conversation we've been having really with all of our clients lately.
Yeah. Yeah. So this slide puts the concept of composability in context of our reference architecture that we started with, right? So at the heart of this architecture is customer data operations or data ops, right? So under foundation services, the leftmost box, this core function really focuses on ingesting, cleaning, unifying, and organizing customer data into a usable foundation. Now from there, it branches out into two key functions. The first one is decisioning and customer data activation, which is like marketing ops, uh, heavy for marketing ops, right? So this is where data is used to drive personalization, for driving campaigns, for audience segmentation, campaign orchestration, and so on. And the second branch there is insights and data intelligence, right? So this focuses more on extracting insights from data for your decision making. Now together, all these three functions, data ops, activation, and intelligence, need to work seamlessly. And a truly composable customer data foundation requires clear understanding of these three distinct functions and how they interconnect with each other. So when selecting a CDP, you need to access your capabilities in terms of data ops, activation, and intelligence in an integrated yet flexible manner. So with that context in mind for CDPs, how do you actually select the right CDP for future? So Tony, back to you for taking us through the process of selecting CDPs.
Thanks, Apoorv. And I'll just issue a friendly reminder that if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to share, anything you disagree with, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll definitely have time for those at the end. So selecting a CDP, the first thing, of course, we always like to do is show you what the marketplace looks like. A couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago, we just had, I'll say 6 years ago, we had 1 box. 3 years ago, we had 2 boxes, then we had 3 boxes, now we have 5 boxes. So, the market is evolving. That's really what we're learning here. And I think there's a couple of different, axes to consider here. And the first is really on the y-axis, suites versus independents. And so the suite vendors tend to want to couple their CDP with your existing investments. We tend to think that you probably want a more decoupled approach, but they make their case. Then the other really important one that we've been getting at here is those that focus a little bit more on processing and those that focus a little bit more on leverage. So it doesn't mean that just because you're on one side or the other that it's 100%, but there's definitely, in terms of the focus of what problems you're trying to solve, there's definitely some sort of boundary there. Now on the leverage side, you can have those that are more activation oriented and those that are leaning a little bit more into decisioning. On the decisioning box, you'll see 4 at the bottom that are B2B CDPs, Dun & Bradstreet, Syncari, LeadSpace, Terminus. I'll just tell you right now, those are all fairly weak offerings, and that's something of a gap in the market. So if you are looking for a B2B CDP, please contact us separately. You have some interesting choices, not always some easy choices there. But anyway, this is the marketplace as it stands in 2024, going into 2025. Of course, the major vendors pitch that you should just license their entire stack, and a big way that they're trying to do that is by locking you into their data layer, and you really want to avoid this. So if you select a CDP from Salesforce or Adobe, do it not because you already have other tools in there out of their quiver, but because that's really the right platform for you, and you definitely want to test that out. We at RSG track about 30 large global enterprise stacks among our council members, and only one of them has gone all in with a single vendor like this. The future really is composable. your CDP ought to be part of that composable decision. So that's just a little caveat that we'll throw out there. You know, having said that, you want to select a CDP the same way that we evaluate CDPs, and that is to do use case or scenario based. In other words, what's really important to you? And it's an interesting measure of the sweep of the CDP landscape that among CDP vendors, you might find as many as 10 different use cases that they're trying to solve for. In some cases by providing the data support, in other cases by actually, you know, fulfilling the entire use case. So you have the two on the left, advanced data customer management, omni-channel and offline aggregation, that are more around data processing. The next two are more analytics based, and then the next six to the right are more leverage based. Outbound marketing, of course, a big one, personalization, e-commerce, digital advertising, an increasingly important use case for paid media there, and particularly paid media integrated with owned and operated. And then household channel and B2B support, something that most CDP vendors don't do particularly well, but some make at least a partial case for it. So the key thing here is to understand, you know, first we talked about architecture, but then, you know, what are the top 2 or 3 use cases that you're trying to light up, particularly in the near term, to really understand those. And that's how you can use our research to then map against what would be some of the vendors that are focused most intensely on those particular use cases. So, okay, you've done some research, you've done some architectural thinking, you've decided which use cases are most important for you, at least at a high level. Now, how do you go about selecting it? So we have some thoughts after doing this for more than 2 decades about applying a more agile selection process that applies design thinking. It's encapsulated in this book that you can find at your friendly neighborhood digital distributor, either in hard copy or soft copy. But the basic concepts here is to make sure that the selection is business focused, team-based, empirical, which is another way of saying test-based, iterative, and adaptive. And, you know, we developed this methodology even before the rise of CDPs, and what's really useful about it is that it works great for CDPs because it's such a confusing and potentially complex and heavyweight technology that you can easily get lost in the weeds. And this gives you a kind of a cookbook for sorting through not just what matters, but what's the best fit in reality, as opposed to what your vendors and consultants are telling you is the best fit. So if you know anything about design thinking, you know that it works on a kind of a model that starts with empathy, then leads to definition, then ideation, prototyping, and testing. And it turns out you can use that same model for selecting CDP vendors. So first we start at the top blue level. There's 30 plus CDP vendors in the marketplace. Where you start to winnow these down is by creating your diverse user stories. Your user stories for a CDP, definitely you're going to have some customer user stories, you're going to have some marketing ops user stories, you may have some data ops user stories, but what are you actually trying to do in the future with this technology? You can then map that against the vendor landscape and come up with 6 to 8 vendors on a short list. At that point, you want to create some sort of RFP, or we'll often do an RFD, which is request for demo. The key thing is that your user stories are the basis of that, so you don't use these Excel checklists. Instead, you create these test cases, and then you test according to, by reviewing proposals and especially demos of your test cases. Now, this orange box, second from the bottom, is the most important one, which is always, always, always do a hands-on bake-off. You may get some pushback from CDP vendors, but we have found CDP bake-offs unusually illuminating, in terms of not just illuminating what's really important for you, which, but also which vendor is a better fit. The difference between a demo and a bake-off is that a bake-off, you're actually hands-on. It may seem like this is complicated to do with the CDP, but it's not. You can have a 3 or 4 day sprint with some dummy data, tens of millions of records, all kinds of fields for segmentation. It's a totally reasonable sprint. Try it out, try before you buy. Then while you're negotiating a license, and CDP negotiations can be complicated, it can be anywhere from 2 to 4 months or more, you do an optional proof of concept with the finalist while you're negotiating the license.
So you use that time to good effect such that you can get to an MVP much faster once you actually sign with the vendor. So this is an iterative, test-based, very human-based process, which works unusually well with this big abstract concept of customer data management. So I really encourage you to follow this methodology. All right. So let's review what we covered today. When you get the slide deck, this is really kind of the slide you want to hang on to and share with your peers, which is, CDPs are continuing to evolve. They are of course, only going to be as good as your data, and you may have data ops work to do before you can fully leverage a CDP. But architectural fit becomes very paramount because CDPs have various notions about how they're going to fit into your architecture. None are inherently good or bad, they're just different. The canonical business scenarios for CDPs are unlikely to change much, which means those 10 are likely to remain those 10. And so the key thing is to get clear about what's most important for you. The vendors we know are sorting out into different categories: processing versus activation versus decisioning. Of course, you'll have some who can say they can do it all. We find that the jack of many trades is typically the master of none, so you need to be careful there. But the most important message here is really encapsulated in number 4, which is to employ an agile-based selection process featuring adaptive testing. You're going to have a lot of choices in this market. Definitely use architecture as a filter, but then prioritize your own handwritten business scenarios with real live people in them to test this. You're still going to need, so the focus should be here on business outcomes. Of course, you'll still need developers and data analysts as part of this, so you want to have a multi-dimensional team that incorporates all those different stakeholders. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that RSG Research and Advisory can help accelerate you through this process and can help take a lot of risk out of it and help you make the right decisions. There's various ways that you can engage us. One is you can license our research, typical subscription model, kind of a self-service model where you can find the best fit vendor using our tools like our shortlist generators. Second thing that larger enterprises often do is license all of our research, in which case you get access to everything and you get access to us to help you kind of not optimize your CDP investment, but optimize your entire stack. Then the third offering that we have is this private exclusive MarTech Council. No vendors, no consultants, just leaders from large enterprise firms like yours who get together twice a year in person and various times offline. Our next offline meeting is actually in 2 weeks. We're going to be meeting about CDPs, how to take it from MVP towards a full rollout of the CDP. So we're going to be talking to a firm that's had a successful CDP implementation for the last 4 years. They're going to share how they got from MVP to really strong ROI. Really exciting session that we'll be having. Again, this is private only for our council members. If you would like to engage with us, this is the guy, Scott, that you talked to, and this is how you can take some next steps here. Scott, I'll turn it over to you while we review what questions have come in.
Great, thanks, Tony and Apoorv. As Tony mentioned, you can reach out to us anytime at explore@realstorygroup.com if you want to try out the tools that we have to help you make the right decision. That's something you can certainly do. You can always download excerpts from our research to get a better sense of how we're evaluating each of these products, and you're welcome to join us for future webinars as well. In particular, we have one coming up in 2 weeks about web content management, what that looks like for 2025. And then also in early January, we'll be discussing Adobe and what the future of your MarTech stack looks like as it pertains to them. So that should be a really enlightening discussion. So I hope to see you then. With that, I do see a couple of questions that have come in.
Yeah, so Apoorv, I may toss this first one from Sumit over to you first, which is, how do you see the role of AI agents in a CDP? So we talked about AI in terms of insights and decisioning. Sumit is asking, what about the role of AI agents in a CDP? Apoorv, you're on mute. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So agentic AI has been we are seeing a lot of discussion around that, right? But in general, using AI agents has been there in CDPs for some time now, right? So the most uh, definitive examples of these are in tasks that require automation, right? So for example, automated data processing, where an AI agent can automate complex data processes such as cleansing, normalization, identity resolution, etc. Another use case of where we see agent AI is for orchestration, right? So orchestrating interactions across multiple channels. We also see agent AIs in other use cases such as recommendation, personalization, etc. But these two are the most popular ones. Right now, you could argue that good old event monitoring subsystem and triggers based on that were always doing this. But the fact is that those event monitoring subsystems and triggers based on that were really more rule based and static and reactive, whereas agentic AI makes it more predictive. It also adapts, it learns, and uses AI and ML techniques to actually make those kind of decisions better and automate things better. So those are the two areas where we see them quite a lot.
Yeah, you know, agentic AI is very hot right now. It's the specific use cases around CDP are not totally played out. I would say it's one of those cases where you definitely want to test and verify, where the vendor demos will look really good. All the more reason to have a bake-off and see whether the agents are ready for prime time. I think in many cases you'll find that they're not, at least as we end 2024 here. Also a message from Natasha. She's asking, what about Microsoft? Haven't talked much about Microsoft CDP. Well, Microsoft CDP, recall, was one of the suite vendors. It's really designed to underpin the Microsoft stack, so the Microsoft CRM and marketing automation offerings, CRM in particular. It's really limited to that scope. It's not really designed to serve as an independent layer in your environment. So it's kind of like the roof rack on your SUV. If they toss it into a deal, they may even require you to use it as a data layer in the future, but it's not necessarily a game changer for you, and certainly not the same kind of power and capability that you get from a more independent, freestanding, best of breed CDP. So with that, we've lingered past the bottom of the half hour, so appreciate you all sticking around. As Scott mentioned, we'll have some subsequent webinars later this month and into January. But for now, this is Tony Burns signing off on behalf of Apoorv and Scott. Bye now.